How far is too far?
Wait.
How far is too far?
How far is too far? Did banning blackletter typeface
for you?
No,
That's what I'm saying.
I'm not gonna be able to pronounce some of these words.
Test. Ugh. Listeners, listen at your own discretion. This is a fun, modern podcast that would blow up online.
Mm-hmm.
How far is too far?
Stop.
How should I voice it? How far is too far? Did banning black letter typefaces in reaction against Nazis only help them achieve their goal of killing art and culture and whatever?
Is reclaiming blackletter type anti-Nazi or neo-Nazi when Fraktur is the specific typefaces co-opted by Nazi Germany, even though its impact resulted in blackletter getting banned altogether?
Was an Antiqua an act of cowardice or rebellion? And where did it go? I'm Ashley.
I'm Anna.
Today in the studio, we have our artist friend, admirer of all things artistic and designerly, Abby, to pitch in with quips, ad-libs, and sound effects as our beautiful yet passive audience member.
She won't be getting interviewed, but her presence will help guide our discussion so as not to sound so scripted.
We also have my roommate, Sophia, joining in the audience. Nobody knows if she'll talk, but maybe she will. That's what you gotta tune in for. Typography is the ultimate visual form of communication. Some of the earliest examples of typography are seen in ancient civilizations. Everybody knows about the hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt made up of imagery to convey complex thoughts that we're still deciphering today. This is so academic sounding.
No, I know.
That's interesting. It reminds me of a project I did like in 4th grade about cuneiform.
Dude, I'm just about to talk about cuneiform.
Really?
Because, okay, so the Rebus principle basically dictates that visual imagery can denote sounds or syllables rather than the literal meanings. And it's the foundation for early typography. An example I included was, like, who decides the shape that the letter A makes the A sound or the Z makes the Z sound? The Rebus principle still applies today, technically, even though we're not looking at pictures of bowls or campfires or whatever, like in cuneiform.
Cuneiform originated in ancient Sumer over 5,000 years ago. It doesn't seem that long ago that Homo sapiens embarked on visual communication, especially through typography, when we've been around for over 160,000 years. Cut to the 1st century or the year 800.
What a year, bro. Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, and while his reign was short-lived, he only reigned for like 14 years, his impact lives on to this day because he reinforced long-lost educational reforms that reinvigorated literacy for the Roman Empire. Like, I'm pretty sure, like, hasn't Phoebe talked about, like, how Charlemagne, like, basically made everybody freaking read?
Phoebe, our historian friend, literally loves Charlemagne so much.
Because he made everybody, like, everybody was straight up illiterate.
Really?
Yeah, but they had, I when I was researching it, they had gone through periods of literacy, I guess. Like, I guess the elites were more literate. But, like, there was, I guess, the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, because a lot of people don't like to talk about them like the Dark Ages, because it was actually when everybody was, like, learning to read, I'm pretty sure.
Really? Y'all should have had Phoebe on for this.
Dude, if Phoebe could have phoned in.
But, that's crazy, yeah. I never thought of it as, like, a back and forth about literacy. Just that everyone moved forward.
So when he enforced the long-lost educational reforms that brought literacy to the Roman Empire, there was a need for a universal script for readability. He didn't create the typeface, but under the reign emerged the Carolingian minuscule, and it brought balance and order to the more difficult to read and write cursive scripts that were previously used, because it basically created what is like modern day lowercase Latin letters, the Carolingian minuscule. It created it. I wrote lowercase Latin letter forms. Say that 5 times fast.
Bro.
Vine boom.
Wait, that's not the part. It's this one.
And then there's another typeface that came afterwards.
Textura emerged as a typeface in response to the Gothic movement at the beginning of the 12th century. It is characterized by tightly spaced angular forms, sharp pointed serifs, and long vertical ascenders and descenders. By the 14th and 15th century, it grew to become the new predominant typeface and influenced the origins of printmaking.
So textura is also known as textura quadrata, and they're like alternates of each other, I guess. And it's the typeface used in the Gutenberg Bible, which was the first major work printed with movable metal type. And this book proved the viability of printmaking using movable metal type to recreate exact letter forms consistently across hundreds of pages. Well, there's multiple numbers thrown out that I've seen when researching, guesstimating how many copies Gutenberg and his partner Johann Fust churned out. The number is rumored to be over like 150 copies, but I did see like 70 copies on one article I was reading, but they were like 70 to 150. Cut to the invention of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg in the middle of the 15th century, which is approximately the 1450s. What a decade.
Right.
What the hell?
Nowadays, okay, we don't even think about our printed materials nowadays for more than half a second. Like, the concept of having a printed material is literally the most negligible, one of the most, is it pronounced banal? Banal. It's one of the most banal things.
Yeah. Wait, it might be banal. Wait.
I think it might be banal.
Whatever.
We don't even think about them. Maybe 2 seconds if you're a history of communication design nerd. A lot of our oohs and ahs are reserved for the finer arts with regards to like text, like handwritten and ornamental illuminated manuscripts. Especially when the printed materials come from half-price books or the 50-cent boxes on the side streets of New York. They don't receive much second thought.
Pulp Fiction.
Mm-hmm. They don't receive much second thought. However, there was a time when print was hot off the press. It was the future. This began when Gutenberg saw a lucrative hole in the market in the time of handwritten script. He realized that cheap mass production of scripts would benefit the population, as access to print materials had previously been reserved for the elite. The invention of the printing press later led to the later inventions of typography as we know it today, but that would be getting ahead of ourselves, and we don't want to do that. No. The important topic of today's discussion is the blackletter typography, and whether or not its resurgence would be beneficial to the contemporary intersection of art and design.
By the end of the 15th century, most printed texts were still in textura typeface, or another variation called textura quadrata. However, the German emperor at the time, Maximilian, sought to create a more German typeface that strayed away from the influence of the popular humanist typeface, Antiqua, in Italy.
We'll talk about her later.
What does humanist mean?
Humanist is like a typeface that is more like...
It has like a human's touch.
It has like a slight like calligraphic influence.
Basically, a humanist like font or typeface would be categorized by like being able to see like how it was made with like a calligraphy
quill
pen
or something.
Like,
But yeah, I like the
too.
humanist typefaces. They basically like taper at the joints, and the way like a pen the ink would lift and pool in certain areas based on the pressure you were applying.
That's dope.
Yeah,
But it still sort of sometimes looks like it's like you can tell it's on a computer. Yeah.
It's not a script though, which would be like a cursive or like something that
that's like handwritten.
literally.
Right.
It's just inspired by the way the ink would move.
Yeah, I feel like that's interesting stuff from a non-graphic design major.
I know,
You
it's
never
stuff
ever think
that
about that.
It's
either
that's
calligraphy or print.
Right?
You know?
You never think of, but there's like nuances, and it all comes back to Johann Gutenberg, because like the invention of movable type basically made that so that individual letters could be replicated exactly across like innumerable amount of copies.
Yeah.
But even still, like the Gutenberg Bible only had like 150 copies. But that was considered mass production at the time.
Yeah.
You know, all
Christians
was
be
all about.
evangelizing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Literally.
Sorry.
Let's continue with Leonard Wagner and what he did.
A calligrapher named Leonard Wagner designed a typeface based on a handwritten script named Bastarda.
Yeah. That's what it was called.
Okay.
sick.
Used by the Emperor's Chancery, and it was named Fraktur based on its broken lines. The front-running German Renaissance artist
Dürer, Carnage, and Grün? Does that sound right?
Yeah.
They got umlauts in their name.
they employed this typeface throughout their works, and it gained mainstream
You got it.
distribution.
Yeah. And so with mainstream distribution comes propaganda, of course. Many of these prints use Fraktur as their primary typeface. And this is actually really interesting that I learned about, y'all. It allowed for distinction between Catholic and Protestant texts.
Really?
Yeah. The Protestants would print in German using Fraktur as their typeface, and the Catholics would print in Latin using Antiqua as their primary typeface. One edition of the Bible even had verses discussing salvation and other positive events begin with a drop cap in Fraktur, and the other verses that discuss damnation, Satan, and other hellish topics began with Antiqua as a drop cap. And a drop cap is basically just you know how in text, like those fancy books, you'll see like a letter that's bigger, the first letter of the paragraph is bigger than the rest, and it's all
like
ornamental.
Right.
That's called a drop cap.
Whoa.
Even when it's just one letter that's bigger, or like the word "the" is bigger.
Yeah.
That's called a drop cap.
And that would literally distinguish,
Wait,
like, if it
if
was
the word does,
Yes, if
it's
it-
still considered a drop cap, even
Yeah.
though it's not.
Because the way it's
line.
employed is as a drop cap.
Dude. That is really interesting.
And so these Bibles that were being printed, if it was a book, if it was a verse about hellfire and damnation, they would use Antiqua as the drop cap for that text, you know, like, and they had the bifocal tongues or whatever they say. What's the they have the bifurcated tongues, and it's in Revelations, and they would use Antiqua for that. But if they're talking about Jesus wept, that verse starts with freaking Fraktur.
Yeah, Fraktur was very like set in like religious backgrounds also.
Yeah, because
So-
it's classic.
why was it mixed if it was Catholic and Protestant?
Well, no, like, okay, so separately, like,
Oh.
but then if they were they were publishing an edition of the Bible, and let's say they're German, they're using Fraktur for the drop caps and Antiqua for ones where it's about Satan and stuff.
Fraktur is a Gothic typeface that became prominent because of its use in well-known, significant historical and religious texts like Martin Luther's Protestant Thank You Bible translation, which helped it become a symbol of German linguistics and gave it more of a religious prestige. It became widespread in Germany, in the German-speaking world, and it was heavily linked to German cultural identity. The 19th century, Fraktur was the dominant script for German-speaking Switzerland, while French and Italian-speaking Swiss used the Latin-based Antiqua font. Fraktur ended up becoming the typeface that symbolizes quote-unquote Germanness. Germans choosing Fraktur was seen as an expression of loyalty to German-speaking culture, and opposed to Antiqua, which associated with French and Italian cultures, and some like Romance cultures. At the time, German-speaking Swiss children were traditionally taught to read and write in Fraktur before any other typeface, so they were very like used to it.
Basically, they used to learn blackletter in school,
Yeah.
which
And-
is really
wait.
tragic.
Part of their argument was that they were going to, like, they are able to read that better, but that's not for everybody. That's people just who learned it as that.
And we'll talk about that in a bit. They used to teach blackletter in schools, just like how they used to teach cursive in schools. But like they're kind of phasing that out now. Did you ever
I
learn
went to
cursive?
private school, so I learned cursive.
Oh,
yeah. And
yeah, I
I
also
all
had
my
cursive for years.
I went to public elementary school and we plowed past cursive. I remember my teacher, we would always hype up having a spelling test in cursive, and it literally never happened, and I was so excited to use cursive in like application in school, and we never got to.
Wait,
Where were we?
Fraktur, because so many Swiss children learn Fraktur from a young age, and since it was so implemented into the culture, a lot of their official publications were printed in the font Fraktur, like such as the 1848 Swiss Federal Constitution, which was printed in German.
Yeah. They be printing stuff in Fraktur. So after World War I, Fraktur started to grow out of style because, you know, things come and things go in the style zeitgeist. And Fraktur, not Fraktur, Germany became more receptive to international influences. Woohoo, right? Wrong. Okay, no more fart sound effects, because now we're talking about freaking Nazis, and they're the worst. With the rise of the Third Reich, the glorification of all things German and traditional resulted in the renewed romanticization of Fraktur, even though it had just grown out of style. Because it's so, like, traditional, and it's German history. It's like, oh, yeah, we love Germany. So this brought on the advent of Fraktur-adjacent typefaces, and a myriad of black-letter typefaces were born. These were primarily created to emphasize the spirit of the new Germany, and a lot of them were unreadable and actually, like, really harsh to look at, because they're just these, like, I'm making, like, black-letter typefaces, and they're pointy, and they're jarring, and it's abrasive, and somehow Hitler, in his genius, hypocritical train of thought, terminated Fraktur from print because they called them Judenletter, and it was like
just so ironic, like with the history of it,
right? Like he said that these are Jewish letters, like the Jew, because you know how like idiots today are like the Jews control like the press, the print, the Hollywood, the everything. And so this was kind of like, this is a historical example of an anti-Semitic, evil, bad word, like, doing this. And so they were all, like, Fraktur was the Jewish letters. And so he banned them. And there was also, like, communication barriers between the German Fraktur typeface and all the territories that they were getting across Europe. So I would think maybe he called them Jewish letters to give, like, a common enemy, even though he just needed to phase it out in order to assimilate all the new territories that the Nazi regime was claiming. And so in January of 1941, Hitler declared Fraktur to be un-German and of Jewish origin. And imminently, all publications had to switch to Antiqua as soon as possible. Enter the Antiqua versus Fraktur dispute, which was the inspiration for this podcast.
In the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a huge debate in Germany and German-speaking Switzerland whether Fraktur, which was a Gothic font that originated in Germany, or Antiqua, which was a Latin script with French, Romance, and English cultures, should be the primary font that was used in schools and prints.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Which one was Fraktur, like, with? Protestant or Catholic?
It was the Protestants.
Again, so were those, like, copies of the Bibles, like, being pushed out and stuff?
They were just, like, going forward, future publications should be in this typeface.
Oh, okay.
And Fraktur is just, like, so deeply rooted in German's history, especially with religious texts. like
Yeah.
any religious text, almost. The arguments for Antiqua were that it is more accessible internationally because the French and English pointed out that it is hard to understand what Fraktur says if you don't grow up with that font or learning that font. So people who were French and English would always advocate so that they could have a more readable font, which Antiqua was.
The people who advocated for Antiqua say that the font is a lot simpler and more hygienic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot more readable. It's a lot more straightforward. There is also, strangely, an issue of posture. There was an argument that a font that was written in a certain angle would give you a weird writing posture and would affect whether or not you could get scoliosis and something else.
Kyphosis, probably. That's what I have.
It's on here,
It's like my back is always hunched over. I always feel like a turtle.
But there were some studies done where they did experiments and saw kids compared to that were writing in a certain angle for their fonts and ones that were writing straight.
It kind of reminds me of when you write in cursive, a lot of people have the tendency to twist the letter and bend their head over so that they can get the perfect oblique on the letters, which is the italic slant.
Yeah.
Because I was doing an art project for my friend recently, Brian, because he wanted me to write in cursive on this envelope, this old speech that someone, some politician had given about civil rights, and they said, can you write it in cursive for me? And I was like, let me twist the paper and go bend my head into my shoulder, and I don't know. So I can imagine something as even more complicated like blackletter offering a lot more complications, literally, for writing posture. But it's interesting to think about a time when kids weren't raised with that.
It's supposed to be simple so that because at this point they just want children to know how to spell.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what it is, and just know letter forms.
Isn't it kind of sad to think about nowadays we're just we just need children to learn, but back then even Charlemagne was able to teach everybody with blackletter typeface, basically, with his Carolinian minuscule.
It was scoliosis and myopia.
Oh, myopia. That's the album by Thursdays that just came out.
Yeah, I was like, that sounds familiar.
Vine Boom?
Oh.
During World War I, there was a push to unify Swiss identity linguistically and tie Swiss regions together. So there was a push to have Antiqua more of a universal or European in that area font, because a big reason is because Fraktur is, as mentioned before, associated with Nazis and the World Wars, and there was a public want for nothing to be that's associated with them to be reminded of them. And I'm not sure what pushed there to be a ban of that font.
I remember reading at one point that the typeface, because it's written with such high weight of strokes, it has this very dark body to it, and it was very reminiscent of the Nazi regime in aesthetic metaphor, whereas Antiqua was light and airy and comprehensible and friendly. Fraktur came off as this more intense and menacing, jarring look.
I mean, what do you think pushed the ban for it, the flip on it?
Well, I don't know. I think we have examples that we're going to talk about in a little bit in the podcast of other examples of things that we've backed away as a society because of Nazis. But I think at the time, especially fresh off the heels of the World War II, anything that resembled blackletter just seemed so Nazi. I mean, even Hitler used Fraktur on the cover of Mein Kampf. That was his typeface, even though he literally declared it of Jewish origins, which makes you think a lot about certain politicians in the modern day who seem to flip-flop on where they stand with certain issues based on the control they're trying to gather. You know? Like, for Fraktur to be of German heritage, to Hitler declaring it to be Jewish origin, let's wipe it out, to him using it on the book about his struggles. Like, it's really interesting to see how he was able to just jerk the font around like that, and the public was able to be influenced it, whether it was pro or against Fraktur.
Right.
And,
still happens today.
And because it was literally the blackletter typeface at the time, it was the one that kind of killed blackletter typeface altogether, because the Holocaust was so, like, it was such an atrocity.
It's the same reason that nobody has that type of mustache anymore, or...
Yeah, the Charlie Chaplin mustache is now a Hitler stash, and now nobody has it.
And how it's the, like, swastika is not seen as, like, a Buddhist symbol anymore.
Which we'll talk about in a little bit.
One of the biggest reasons that there was a push for Antiqua is because there is a lot of popularization of the typewriter. And because the typewriter needed to be clear and needed to be able to, like, you'd be able to read it quickly, they used Antiqua for a lot of the fonts. So there was a push for schools to teach Antiqua so that kids will have an easier time adapting to the typewriter, because they foresaw it to be, like, a bigger thing, which it did become.
And so the arguments to keep Fraktur, obviously, were because it followed centuries of tradition, and switching to a more basic font like Antiqua would break said tradition. And there was a concern that switching would make it so that future generations would have trouble reading German classics such as Goethe and Schiller. And whereas Antiqua used the argument of accessibility, Fraktur used the argument of aesthetics, because obviously the black letter looks hard, it looks cool, and Antiqua was just kind of like this nothing font to people who are used to black letter. People in support of Fraktur argued that there was more beauty in the Fraktur fonts, and the ornate letters cannot beat out Antiqua's simple form. The economic documents at the time also used Fraktur font, such as business correspondences in border regions like Basel and St. Gallen, and there's also a scientific claim that some studies show that Fraktur actually causes less strain on the eyes, because reading it will require your eyes to move less than reading Antiqua. Like, the strain is caused by how much you're reading. Isn't that kind of interesting?
I'm not sure how accurate those studies were, but there are studies about it. Because I feel like your eyes would have more strain reading a black letter font than something like Antiqua.
I feel like my eyes would get tired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's basically, that is strain.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how accurate those studies are, but it is, like, good to know that there was studies on this.
Yeah.
To support Fraktur.
So at the height of, like, Hitler's reign, like, he was all about Fraktur. And it was all about, like, and it was on everybody's mind because it, like, coincided with, like, printing media getting worldwide and stuff.
Yeah,
like
and then he flip-flopped.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of, like, Nazi or, like, those types of publications that use the Fraktur font primarily.
Right, and those got spread, like, everywhere. So everyone was like, no freaking Fraktur.
No freaking Fraktur. That was a headline, I think.
Really?
No freaking Fraktur. Advocates that debated in favor of Fraktur also say that the font is one thing that aided in the unification of the German-speaking world, and there is no way that it should be abandoned. Because it united Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And it's like, this is, like, let's gatekeep, like, this is our font, we have so much history with it, like, yeah, this is awesome. Like, why would we abandon it when we're in such a global crisis, such as the Holocaust, which our leader caused? It's a very, I mean, what side do you think you would be on, Abby?
About, like, if it's bad?
Or Antiqua versus Fraktur?
That's a good question. I mean, if I saw Fraktur, I wouldn't think Nazi because I haven't taken these classes, like, that you guys have taken. But I wonder if, like, the average, like, maybe somebody in Germany would, like, literally today think differently.
We should go test it out when we're in Germany.
Yeah, but I think that I would be partial to Fraktur because I do like how gothic it is.
I know, I hate how that whole thing caused us to
Like
not
gothic
learn.
went on the down.
I know, it stopped us learning blackletter in school, and that's crazy to me.
Yeah.
I mean, if y'all went to public school, y'all would have barely learned cursive.
Yeah.
You went to private school?
For high school.
Oh, okay.
I will say
cursive. I would love to have those like hand skills, but like with this generation, sadly, there's no need for it.
When
Absolutely
requiring
not,
kids
yeah.
to handwrite essays, I can understand that print is way more like readable and standardized.
Yeah.
So I get why it's taught, but I do think that like even I can't read most cursive. Like I went to public school and I didn't really learn it, so.
Really?
It's crazy how much our handwriting the importance of it has like declined.
Yeah, I wonder. Literally sometimes I see someone's handwriting and I wonder how it didn't get, like, someone didn't nip that in the bud 10 years ago.
Nobody cares anymore.
Well,
Yeah, because you don't need to write stuff.
Chromebook stocks are up.
Really?
And cursive skills stocks are down. So.
I mean, I honestly don't feel super confident in my ability to read cursive anymore because obviously, like, on the internet, you're never reading something in cursive. It's only regular, like, type print, right?
Yeah.
But even though I learned it, and I used to have to write every single assignment in cursive.
I actually read a research paper once because I was so curious about why men, and this is a generalization that I personally have noticed over my life, have the worst handwriting.
Yeah.
Men consistently look like they have dysgraphia, I feel like.
It's also because I feel like it's pushed more on girls.
It is, and the research study talked about how aestheticism is pushed on girls from a very young age, and being refined in ways that you can be perceived is very encouraged, whereas men being wild and free and careless is encouraged from a young age.
Yeah, you really are pushed to be like that beautiful, something special, like down to the bone.
You're pushed to be an aesthetic.
You know?
Even if like outside of being pushed into rigidity, like there is like I workshopped my handwriting so many times when I was growing up, and until I got it exactly where I wanted to be, to have its like own charm, and I think it's like girls are pushed to care. Okay, let's hop back on the rails.
Anyway, despite the whole Fraktur Antiqua debate, the Federal Swiss publication shifted the default font from Fraktur to Antiqua in 1873. There was a push for the use of Antiqua in primary schools in the year 1881, but the opposition for it was incredibly fierce. The opposition for it was so fierce that it led to some places like St. Gallen and Basel to reverse their decision and reintroduce Fraktur into their primary schools. So, I mean, a few places had it. During World War I in 1915, wow. The shift towards using Antiqua accelerated a lot because of the concerns of the growing popularity of the typewriter and national unity. By 1935, almost all the Swiss areas had made the transition from Fraktur to Antiqua as their main script. There was a lot of hidden cultural, political, technological, and scientific reasons behind the Antiqua versus Fraktur dispute. This is why it can still be considered a prominent and important debate in today's history.
By the end of the war, German type designers and printers grew understandably weary of employing Fraktur or any adjacent blackletter typography in print, and thus the art of blackletter was phased out of common usage. Seeing it was reminiscent of a sore history, and any association with the worst reign in recent memory was to be avoided at all costs.
Paul Renner is the guy. There's also another typeface that almost became the new Nazi typeface after the ban of Fraktur. Paul Renner designed Futura, and he came to the idea from book design because it's essential to have an easy to read font that communicates clearly so you are able to quickly read the book. In the 1920s, the Bauhaus School of Design was becoming popular, and he used that as his inspiration. Their simple designs and like neat show for efficiency. He thought that the Fraktur font was, quote unquote, like Lederhosen, outdated and quaint. In 1927, Futura went on the market with the tagline, "The typeface of our time." Because of this, Futura was a symbol of the future, and that ended up being an issue for the Nazis. Renner became an outcast because he wrote an anti-Nazi essay and eventually got arrested because of it and exiled from Germany. Even because of this, there was a change of mind, I guess, and he ended up being allowed to return back to Germany, and his Futura font was used a few times in Nazi publications. Like, even after all of that, out of nowhere, the Nazis decided that Fraktur was a Jewish style, so they banned it and warmed up more to Futura. However, at this point, Futura was already recognized as a more international typeface, which could be one of the biggest reasons why it saved it from becoming the next Nazi typeface.
So that's really interesting about how Futura was originally, like, it had become banned by Nazis, but eventually the Germans warmed back up to it. I wanted to talk also about other things that the Nazis have kind of created as an impact in similar way to blackletter. A recent unidentification from Nazis today is the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. During Nazi regime, Dr. Hans Asperger engaged in a atrocity called Kindereuthanasie, or however it's pronounced in German, which means like euthanasia of children, basically, where they would round up and slaughter children up to 16 years old who were determined mentally or physically disabled. At least 5,000 children died this way, both Jewish and non-Jewish. But 1 year after Hans Asperger died, a British psychologist, because at the time of his death, he was revered as this guy that, like, saved all these autistic children and, like, was defining them and, like, giving them identity and stuff.
Why, if he was killing people?
Because of probably propaganda. But this British psychologist coined the term Asperger's syndrome a year after he died in order to define a part of the autism spectrum disorder. And, like, regardless of all that, it's another example of unweaving Nazi agenda from modern usage, as Asperger's syndrome is a diagnosis. It's, like, slowly leaving common vernacular. And I wanted to know if you think learning about its history would inspire more people to unidentify with the diagnosis, and could the same be said about blackletter, or more specifically Fraktur? A lot of questions, but I think that's an example of something with history that has been impacted by Nazis that I think is important to talk about.
I definitely noticed the lessening of people using Asperger's during my lifetime, because I remember
I feel
in
like
high
it's
school,
very recent.
Yeah, I had a friend who was diagnosed with Asperger's, and now, like, nobody says that anymore.
Yeah.
Like, and that's just like a 5-year period.
Yeah.
You know?
It's interesting the change we can make, especially I think it's important nowadays as neo-Nazis grow more prevalent. I'm not saying that they have anything to do with Asperger's. They're on some other stuff, but, like, just separating the common vernacular from that as much as possible, I think, is very important. But it's interesting when you consider, like, the niche of typography and how harshly anti-Nazis would stay away from blackletter. Like, you never think about the Nazi implications of blackletter, because I think we've distanced ourselves from it a lot.
Yeah. And the distancing happens so fast these days with the internet. Like,
Yes.
Back in the day, it probably would have taken, like, 20, 30 years for something like that to stop.
Another thing that was, like, changed forever because of the Nazis is the swastika. Perhaps the most jarring example of a design that cannot be touched with a 10-foot pole by Western media. Despite its origins in Hindu, Buddhist, and
Jainist
symbol for good fortune, they rotated it 45 degrees, and now it can't be seen without the immediate identification as alliance to Hitler's rules, no matter if it is the original or not. Regardless of the angle of which is depicted or, like, the way it is shown, nobody can see that type of pattern anymore without immediately associating it with Nazis, which is the same with Fraktur, the same with the Charlie Chaplin mustache and everything else. This is indisputably a dead symbol to all designers and the general populace, at least in the Western society. I can't speak on behalf of the East, but in America, you would be hard-pressed to come by the swastika and other contexts besides neo-Nazis.
It's terrible because, like, the swastika, like, it's a trope in the design world that at one point you're going to accidentally design something that is evocative of a swastika. Same with genitals, same with anything. And it's like, it does hold up as a design, purely as a design, without any context attached to it. You know, it's, like, dynamic, it's, you know, visually interesting, it's a pattern, it's easily patterned, but it has been rooted in such atrocities that it's just completely untouchable. And it's crazy to think about the same that could be said about a typeface at one point, you know? And now, like, you'd ask any layperson, or even a lot of designers, like I've talked to my professors about it, and they don't even know about the black letter influence from Nazis, you know? So it's interesting to think about things that are so far removed from the Nazi regime that they've kind of circled back around, and when that's determined to be okay again. Like, when was the switch when we decided black letter was okay again? And is it? Or is it like the swastika? Or did it exist before? Like, the Hindu symbol existed before the Nazi regime, just as black letter existed before the Nazi regime.
It probably just it's gonna go along with the lack of education, because if I saw Fraktur without having you guys as friends, I'd be like, cute goth typeface. I'd be like, cute goth font.
That's a good point.
So,
and speaking of goth, counterculture has also been an inadvertent safe space for Nazi rhetoric, specifically in the 70s and 80s. And I'm tying this in through black metal's inclusion of black letter typography in their album art. We've seen the usage of swastika in punk movements because they were very against, like, whatever their predecessor was against. And, you know, the baby boomers were very anti-Nazi at the time. So a lot of punks, even like Susie Sue, they would incorporate a swastika into their outfit. And now we now know that is not okay. But they were just so anti-status quo that they wanted to be reactionaries, and they wanted to be just anti-establishment. And at the time, it was very anti-Nazi. You know, we abandoned a whole black letter typeface because of its Nazi associations, even though, like, what is it, 4, 5, 6, 60 years later, like, we don't even think about that. But, like, back then, like, there was this, like, kind of a place where Nazis could express themselves with, like, swastikas on their freaking arm because it was just counterculture. And I think that's kind of inappropriate.
That's crazy. And there had to have been, you know, I mean, y'all know that Dead Kennedy song, Nazi punks,
Nazi punks fuck off. Yeah,
like, so it's like you're in your subculture, you're in your counterculture, in your area where you think, like, everybody's gonna be kind of like you in something like that.
Yeah.
And then there's someone who's like just like putting a swastika on their like jacket because their parents like didn't like Nazis.
Yeah, and they're just trying to be. There's a word for it that eludes me right now, but they're just trying to get a reaction, and that's why they had to say stuff like Nazi punks F off.
Yeah.
Because there was a safe space for them.
I think the, like, movement itself should be enough to show where you stand in that. Like, I feel like saying, like, no Nazis is, like, it's more like an obvious thing now. Yeah. Like, you don't have to tell people that you're against Nazis.
Man, I don't even know.
You'd be surprised.
We are, like, moving in a direction. I can get behind it, you know. If you're gonna go,
let me think what's best.
Put on your jacket that you hate Nazis, and you gotta use the swastika small and across through it to get that point across. Then
it's just like the culture for that is not that big anymore, so people aren't not gonna know what you're talking about.
You think so? But it's one of those things that's immediately perceptible. Like, if you see something with an X over it, you know that means I don't agree.
Some people still get beat up for that because they have the Nazi symbol on it. It's like the colored
Right.
laces in your shoes.
Lace
Like that's
code, yeah.
and like when that was prevalent a lot of people knew that.
Stuff like that. Like, I think the sentiment behind it and the intent is clear if it's crossed out, but I've heard some Jewish people say that, like, maybe just don't use the symbol at all.
Yeah.
Maybe there's better ways to represent, or a new symbol that should be introduced to be anti-Nazi.
And it ties back to blackletter and how we've been removed from it as not for Nazi associations. I know that, like, going back to the Futura example, our professors have warned us against using Futura because of its associations to Nazism, as well as other fonts that have controversial histories, like Gil Sans for having, like, a pedophile create it. Incest pedophile.
What?
Yeah, there's this prolific font called Gil Sans, and the guy who made it is a terrible person, and you can look him up. But our teachers tell us not to use him, even when he's used as an example as an archetypal typeface for certain typeface classifications. They warn us against using Gil Sans because of its controversial history. Same with Futura. If you're talking about something that has certain context to it, you might not want to use Futura as the typeface because of its past. And the same can go for blackletter typeface, especially in the current political climate. Like, you know, Elon Musk is saying he's dark gothic MAGA. What are the implications of using blackletter typeface with Elon Musk?
Well, how much do you think how much do you agree with them saying that when the average person, I just looked up Gil Sans, like, I would never, ever, 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 ever consider that. Or Futura.
But it's like using him empowers his mind, and his mind is
Okay.
twisted.
Right.
There's a
Yeah.
billion things that look just like that. It's such a generic font. But, you know, blackletter, they ceased to teach it in schools because of how far the Nazis went with it. I mean, they were jerking us around whether or not we should use it.
Mm-hmm.
How far is too far? Did banning blackletter typefaces in reaction against Nazis only help them achieve their goal, or did it dismiss their goal?
I'm not sure because it was the Nazis that banned it. So I think that I am still not entirely sure what the reasoning behind calling it a Jewish font and then banning it was, even though they used it. But again, like, Hitler's decisions for everything make no sense.
The narcissist mind never made linear sense.
Yes. But I don't think...
I mean, the
banning
dude
it-
believed in the Aryan race, and he had freaking dark eyes and dark
That's what
hair.
I'm saying. Yeah, like that, and the fact that his mom was Jewish.
Literally.
I think that the fact that it's not as seen as a Nazi typeface as much today definitely helps with helping them, like, go against their goal. But the fact that they got that much time definitely helped them achieve it.
Do y'all think reclaiming blackletter type is anti-Nazi or neo-Nazi?
I don't know, because to me, when I look at it, it's just a gothic type. I think, you know, the average person would think of it as something completely unrelated and niche, even.
Yeah.
Especially with the way our culture goes today with, like, aesthetics and stuff.
And
That's
why
a good
should
point.
we let, like, somebody, like, this something ruin something so beautiful just because it was associated with
Right.
that? And it was a lot of them, but a lot of it was only Fraktur, one typeface. And I think that there's definitely, like, no way that we're going to be able to have that specific font back in circuit without it having some
Historical,
Yeah.
like, implications. Especially when there's a
controversial
there's-
controversy.
yeah, there's a billion blackletter typefaces now. It's not really, like, an issue.
So I don't think that, like, it should, just because one typeface was used at this, it should destroy an, like, beautiful, like, ornate, like, line of typefaces just because.
It'd be interesting to see something like that happen modernly when people are so afraid of, like, especially with, like, Elon Musk and a bunch of other politicians afterwards coming out and doing, like, a Zeke Heil, like, all, like, the neo-Nazi crap that's going around today, if there would be something kind of in parallel that happens to it. Maybe it's the act of using Twitter, you know? Maybe that's the new version of employing Fraktur, you know?
Radical thought.
I know, because now it's called X, which has this It went from a light blue bird, a symbol of freedom, to an X, which is kind of a symbol of
I've never even thought about that.
cancellation or jailing or
That's
like
crazy.
restriction, and it's black and white now.
We all just wrote that off as just some stupid thing, but it probably did have greater implications and things like gears turning in Elon Musk's like
Twisted
cruel,
head.
evil mind. Yeah.
Literally. Well, I mean, my final question was Antiqua an act of cowardice or rebellion, but I don't know if I want to ask it.
I don't.
It
think
seemed
so.
like an act of necessity.
Yeah, it seems like it was implemented for just because people wanted to have more accessibility, and the only reason that it was debated so much was because during the same time the Holocaust was happening, so they wanted to paint it as like a rebellion. I don't think it really was. I just think it was a natural turn into like the future.
A means to an end. But we're out here freaking idolizing blackletter typeface as the alternative people tend to do. But what about Antiqua? That was the most radical thing, and it's so unassuming. We should integrate typewriter font into our daily life as progressives. Or do we already? I don't think it means much to people who aren't designers.
I don't think so either.
But with that is the conclusion of Typecast, the fractured legacy of Fraktur. I'm Ashley.
I'm Anna.
And
I'm Abby.
that's Abby.
That is Abby.
And our A name
Yeah,
our A names are purely coincidental. Thank you for listening,
thank you.
and I'll see you next time.